Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me today, and it's my pleasure to be here to share with you what I have been doing for so many years about recycling. I was giving the topic quite long, contaminant residue in and from recycled paper, paperboard, and plastic, contaminant identification, food safety concern, and regulatory controls. And it looked like, well, to be honest, I have a confession. I not only did with the recycling, on the plastic recycling, I didn't do any paper recycling, but I know a little bit after I was working. Actually, the 14 years with the FDA, I worked in a laboratory. And then I switched to become the consumer safety officer 11 years ago. And I didn't realize that, when I was working in a lab at that time, 25 years ago, I could not imagine that today I'm here with the Office of Food Additive Safety and coordinating the review of the plastic recycling. But anyway, I want to go to the next slide about, is this one? Oh, this one better. Instead of giving you some kind of really the outline of my presentation, what I would like you to have today, I want to share with you my objective and hope that you achieve what I want you to have. One is to understand the regulatory process that addresses chemical contamination and a food safety concern for the use of recycled paper, paperboard, and plastic in food packaging application. In the regulatory process involve two things. One is a submission, which I call the voluntary submission of the recycling process to FDA, and FDA will review it. After FDA determines that the process is effective, we're going to issue an agency federal opinion letter, or so-called non-objection letter. And that letter is issued for the process, okay, that has demonstrated to be effective in cleaning and producing recycled material that is suitable for food contact use. And second, I want you to understand about the trend and challenge in regard to the recycling technology and the use of recycled plastic in food contact application. Since my talk covers paper and plastic, I want to divide it. I don't want to mix it up, okay? But first, I want to talk about the paper recycling. In terms of regulatory framework for recycled paper and paperboard, we have the explicit regulation under 21 CFR 127-260 on the pulp from reclaimed fiber. That particular regulation addresses a process and a source control of reclaimed fiber. The reclaimed fiber prepared by repulping with water to recover the fiber with the least possible amount of non-fibrous pulp substances. In terms of the source, there are two sources. It's industrial waste, sometimes called the pre-consumer post-industrial material, from the manufacture of paper and paperboard products. And the second source is the used paper and paperboard, or sometimes called the post-consumer material. But these source materials should not contain any poisonous or deleterious substance that migrate into food. Even if you have it, you have to have the process that's effective to clean and remove it. Otherwise, you're going to be trapped into the finished pouch, and after you make the container, it might migrate into the food. So that's a regulation. If you look at it's kind of qualitative. It doesn't really tell you exactly, okay, how you're going to do it. So you got to, if you are a recycler, you got to demonstrate that your recycled paper does not contain any toxic substance or harmful chemical that could potentially migrate into the food. In terms of paper recycling submission, in the past decade, FDA received very few voluntary paper recycling submissions that resulted in federal opinion letters. And I think that because most paper recyclers intend to follow the guidance developed by the trade association or organization to ensure that recycled paper complies with the 21 CFR 126-260. Somehow, periodically, we did receive inquiry regarding to chemical contaminants, such as lead or other heavy metal from the printing ink. And as Dr. Selke, who presented before me this afternoon, she talked about the paper coming from the commingled different type of the feedstock. And I think most of the time on newspaper, and that's the ink in there. And that the process itself needs to be effective in removing some kind of heavy metal from the ink. And also, sometimes we recommend the person who requests about the heavy metal and things like that. We recommend that if you can use the ink that did not have any heavy metal, probably would be safer. But again, in terms of the technical consideration, it would be possible in produce that kind of paper product with the with the ink that doesn't contain any heavy metal. And keep in mind that paper recycler is responsible for ensuring that their recycled paper meet the applicable regulation under 21 CFR 126-260, and therefore it's safe for the food contact application. Now, I'm going to talk a lot more about the plastic recycling. Let me give you some background when I started. When I started with FDA in 1991, there was some kind of, at that time, probably a lot of people knew that it has some kind of a perception about the shortages of landfill of solid waste disposal at that time. And if you look at the composition of the solid waste, and you find out that a lot of them, in terms of bulky and volume, probably the beverage and food containers that occupy quite a large amount in the landfill. So at that time, there are several packaging company and the food company interested in recycling of the 2-liter bottle. And you know, 2-liter bottle of PET is quite big, and that's why it's quite a lot of material. So, and also PET is a good material. It's a high value compared with the olefin, so it might vary some kind of possible and also some kind of economic incentive to recycle the good quality material. So they starting developing the process to recycle 2-liter post-consumer PET bottle. And the initial process that developed at that time, it turned out to be tertiary recycling process that Dr. Selke mentioned about depolymerization and repolymerization of polymer. And I will talk about that detail later on. And because of the chemical recycling process, very expensive and energy intensive. So they, later on, the industry interested in developing the less expensive process, called the physical or secondary recycling process. And the latest development is so-called the super clean, which is dealing with the solid stating of the PET. And keep in mind that FDA supports recycling, but the recycled material must be safe for food contact use. What that means is the recycled material should be derived from the food grade material, and recycled material meet existing all applicable authorizations. In terms of regulatory framework for recycled plastic, we have none, okay? Unlike recycled paper, we have 126-260. For plastic, we do not have explicit regulation that address the use of post-consumer recycled plastic for food contact application. So we turn into the general provision applicable to indirect food additives under 21 CFR 174.5. Especially the paragraph A2 state that any substance used as a component of article that contact food shall be a purity suitable for its intended use. What that means, for both polymer and adjuvant is used to make a plastic or food contact material to make the bottles for beverage or any food container, both the polymer and adjuvant need to be compliant with regulation that authorize the use of this polymer and adjuvant. In terms of safety concern, there are two categories of the contamination, of the contaminants. One is the incidental contaminants that derive from the misuse of the bottle or container. In the 1990s, I think 2-liter bottle, and I think nowadays probably it's still true that some consumer use the bottle to collect waste household chemicals, such as used motor oil, pesticides, and then they use it, and then after they finish using, they discard the empty bottle, and someone collect it, and then also recycle. So now it becomes the issue that anything chemical that would be migrate into the polymer matrix of the bottle, and after you process it, you might not be able to remove them all out, and that becomes a concern. And also, as you may know that the PET bottle that's used for non-food containers now is made from food grade. So now they have some kind of movement of collecting the non-PET, non-food PET bottles as well, and mix with the food PET bottles, and then recycle together. So now you have the different, another source of the contaminant. That means some from the non-food residue from mouthwash or detergent, for example, because you see on the shelf. And now clear bottle, they use all the PET bottle now. And the industry say the PET bottles, they use for non-food, also food grade. So that means both of them can be collected together and recycled together into the food grade. And also during the recycling process, the recycle may add some kind of really non-approved adjuvant into the process, because as Dr. Selgin mentioned, when you keep reprocessing the polymer, the quality deteriorated, it could break down, and you need to build the quality up to the point that you can use the material for the end-use application, in this case, the full contact application. So that means they might really add some kind of adjuvant in there. And that becomes the concern that the adjuvant has not been authorized yet. And that's the kind of thing that we need to address, okay? In order to address the chemical contamination from two sources that I mentioned in the previous slide, FDA first developed the guidance document back in 1992 and then updated in 2006. And the guidance document is the use of recycled plastic in food packaging and chemistry considerations. In this guidance, they addressed the chemistry issue about the potential migration of chemical contaminant from the post-consumer recycled plastic into the food. In that guidance document, we did two things. One is to recommend a surrogate testing protocol for evaluating the efficacy of a proposed recycling process to remove various unknown chemical contaminants, because we don't know that at home the people use what kind of pesticide, we might know a little bit in terms of what potential chemical would be, but we don't know exactly what consumer misuse that bottle before discard bottle and be collected for recycling. And also that guidance documents establish an acceptable upper limit of dietary concentration at 0.5 parts per billion. I think you heard this morning talking about the threshold declaration, and that probably the same. It derived from that kind of concept of threshold declaration, that when the contaminant is quite really be present in the food as such a trivial amount, so that chemical is exempt from being regulated at the food additive or the food contact substance. Why we need the surrogate testing protocol? As I mentioned, because the contamination in the bottle or in the plastic container are unknown. We need to really some kind of capture what the possibility of the chemical there would be to make sure that it has been removed during the recycling process. So we recommend to use the known chemicals or called surrogate that are specifically chosen to simulate the various physical and chemical properties of unknown chemical contaminants. And then when we intentionally contaminate the material, we subject that material into the proposed recycling process. And then we analyze the residual level of the contaminant that we know what they are, and then see how much remain. And from that residual level, we can determine what the potential migration would be. Now we talk about recycling process. Okay. There are three different processes. The first one, I believe that identified by the EPA in terms of the primary recycling, secondary or tertiary recycling. The primary recycling is the use of regrind of the pre-consumer or post-industrial or industrial scrap. Like when you make a bottle, okay, you're going to have to go injection mold molding, and you have to have excess of the plastic. And then in order to make sure the mold is filled, and then you make the very complete bottle. What excess amount of the plastic, you trim it off, and you don't want to throw it away, and then you some kind of regrind and then feed it back into the process. And we allow that kind of use as long as the collection of the scrap or pre-consumer or post-industrial material is collected under the good manufacturing practice. That means avoid any potential contamination of that material. Now the secondary recycling or physical reprocessing typically involve the aqueous washing, drying, remelting, and foaming. And super clean, as I mentioned earlier, is on the solid stating. And tertiary recycling, or sometimes they call chemical processing, and sometimes they call the hydrolysis, methanolysis, or glycolysis, typically apply to PET and polyethylene naphthalate or PEN. And they involve the depolymerization of the post-consumer PET or PEN to starting material, which is the form of monomers or oligomers. And then you purify the starting material to remove all the potential contaminants. And then after you get the clean starting material, you start repolymerize that material and regenerate the new polymer, which actually as clean as a virgin polymer that can be used for food contact application. As I mentioned earlier, that recycling submission is considered voluntary. Okay? So it's not mandatory because anyone can use your recycled material as long as it's clean and no migration to the food at the level that causes safety concern. But in the 1990s, I think we did discuss with industry about developing the regulation, but I think industry prefer that to be some kind of real submission on a voluntary basis. So we didn't take the route to develop the regulations just like the recycled paper. So we offer the service to the recycler or the manufacturer to evaluate the process to make sure that the process is effective. We evaluate the process, not evaluate the recycled product. FDA never really endorse or evaluate any finished product at all. Keep in mind on that. The information that we recommend to be submitted in the recycling submission include the complete description of the proposed recycling process. You identify it to be primary, secondary, or tertiary recycling. You identify what the feedstock. Normally, we recommend the source control, similar to the recycled paper that listed in the regulation under the 176-260. Because if you can control the source, you can have a little bit better understanding what coming in your material. For example, you collect only the food containers. Likelihood that all the bottles, or the container are food grade already. So now we look at in terms of what the process in order to remove potential contaminant in case they are present. We don't know they are present or not. We assume they are present. And that's why the recycler must demonstrate that the process that they propose to use to generate the recycled plastic is effective. And how to demonstrate that? Okay, one is by doing the circuit testing. And normally we don't recommend for the tertiary recycling process anymore. And also in recycling submission need to have some kind of calculation to demonstrate that dietary concentration are 0.5 part per billion or below. You can do by one of the four following approaches. One, assume the 100% migration testing using the food simulating solvent. Migration model, this morning we talked about the fixed law, and also use effective barriers to have something that to prevent the contaminant migrating from the recycle layer across the barrier into the food. If we have that barrier, it can prevent the migration, so you can use it. So you don't need to really clean the material to the point that you can use 100%. And because in this case, you can use the concept of the multi-layer structure. And after we evaluate the process, and we determine that the process is effective and the intended use does not pose any safety concern, we issued a favorable opinion letter, or NOL. This slide shows the current non-objection letter that we have issued. Up to now, about 194, 75% associated with PET, polystyrene about 10%, high-density polyethylene about 5%, and other plastic about probably 10%. Interpretation of the non-objection letter. Non-objection letter issue an informal favorable opinion for the effective recycling process. Although the non-objection letter are not legally binding, they have been helpful to both FDA and the regulated industry. The letter should not be interpreted as a license, but the company can sublicense that process to a third party. The manufacturer and recycler is still responsible for the safe use of recycled plastic in food packaging. And the letter are solely applied to recycling process as described in the voluntary submission. If any modification to the recycling process, we may recommend that a new submission is required, or maybe a new non-objection letter we're going to issue. In terms of sub-licensing, in the past decade, we have seen a lot of companies, like a third party, they sub-license the process that we issue the non-objection letter, and they come forward to us and ask for another non-objection letter to be listed for that company name. And we say no, okay? You don't need that. As long as the process that is sub-licensed from the original company exactly identical, they're going to use it. So basically, the non-objection letter is applicable to the process regardless of the manufacturer or recycler. So now in conclusion, and trends and challenges, the submission of recycling processes to FDA review are voluntary. Non-objection letter is an informal, favorable opinion letter and not legally binding. The manufacturer is still responsible for the safe use of recycled material in food contact application. In the past decade, FDA received only a few paper recycling submissions as compared to a few hundreds for plastic recycling submission. And PET recycling submission have dominated, accounting for approximately 80% of all non-objection letters that FDA issue. In the recycling submission nowadays that we have received, more submissions include the combined circuit testing, migration modeling, for use to estimate the migration level and to demonstrate the dietary concentration to each contaminant below 0.5 part per billion. And that the threshold declaration limit that FDA equals to negligible risk for a contaminant. The challenges exist in developing the recycling technology for plastic other than PET, and also increasing use of recycled plastic in food contact applications. And I hope that for objective that I set, I hope that you have understand better about the FDA process of reviewing both paper and plastic recycling. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer. Thank you.